Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. We bring together the latest research in linguistics, language acquisition, and biblical studies to better understand the biblical languages and ultimately the biblical text. As always, this episode is brought to you by Biblingo, the premier solution for learning, maintaining, and enjoying the biblical languages. Visit biblingo.org to learn more and start your 10-day free trial.
I'm Kevin Grasso, your host for this episode, and I'm excited to talk with Dr. Joshua Jipp today about key terms in the letters of Paul. Welcome to the show, Josh.
Thanks, Kevin.
So just a little bit about Josh. He has taught New Testament in a variety of settings, including as a teaching fellow at TEDS before joining the faculty at Trinity. He has published essays in Themelios, Journal of Theological Interpretation, Journal for the Study of the New Testament, Catholic Biblical Quarterly, Bulletin of Biblical Research, New Testament Studies, Horizons in Biblical Theology, Journal of Biblical Literature, and Journal of Theological Studies. And he also has a few books. One of them we will be talking about today. He loves reading novels, playing all kinds of sports, especially baseball with his kids, being outdoors, listening to music, and having great conversations with his wife. So today we're going to talk about his Messianic Theology of the New Testament, and we are kicking off this series on key terms in Paul with this book to try to present it as sort of a test case for what happens when you take a term like Christos in Greek and you give a new definition to it, or one that the scholarly field hasn't really accepted until recently, and then you work it through in the text itself. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to say, okay, here's this term, Christos. Josh, you've written a Messianic theology of the New Testament, meaning that you're defining Christos as Messiah, right? And you're working that out in Paul, in the Gospels, in theology. So just want to start off with some method, but before we get there, can I just, I think I read either in your book, Christ is King, or in the Messianic Theology, it seems like this book is kind of like a, you taking Novinson's work and saying, okay, now who cares? Is that a apt summary of?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I try to get the timeline right exactly. I had some of these ideas, I don't want to make this too long, but I had some of these ideas actually coming out of reading, my own study of Romans, back in the late 2000s, like 2007, 2008. It's probably, before I had even heard the name Matt Novinson, and ended up, when I did my PhD at Emory, kind of shifted course and went into Acts instead of working on Paul. So once I finished at Emory, I was really interested then to kind of revisit this project. I can still remember, running across Matt Novinson's book and being like, oh my gosh, no, please, read it, loved it, was kind of already convinced, but he, I thought worked through the argument that Christos isn't, a title or an honorific that means Messiah in just, a really compelling way. But fortunately, some of my ideas, that were sort of how, if Messiah, if Christos means Messiah, then wouldn't we expect that he would actually conform to depictions of the good or ideal king, both in the Jewish texts as well as Greco-Roman texts? It didn't seem to me as though he had kind of, taken that next step. It wasn't really the goal of his book. And so, I was, to some extent, I think that's fair to say. In many ways, my Christ is King is, after I had read Novinson, trying to build on, okay, if Christos is an honorific, that means Messiah. So what? What does that mean for our exegesis of certain Pauline texts, and even more broadly, Pauline theology?
Right. Yeah. That's great. And I that is also the way I read both of you, and they're very complementary. You're not saying the same thing. Yeah. So just to what we're going to do, I think first is just talk about a little bit about method. So with all of these people in our series, they all have their word, right? And they kind of stick to their word, and they say, "Oh, this word is the word," right? So for example, Teresa Morgan just came out with New Testament and the Theology of Trust, right? You have your Messianic Theology of the New Testament. So I guess from a methodological standpoint, how do we decide what's most important. Like, what should we be writing about, in terms of what's central in Paul in a sort of like organizing way, or I mean, we could also say, okay, maybe they're both very important, right? And one influences they are both very important, but how do we get to what is kind of the core of Paul's theology?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything that's incredibly scientific in terms of my method here. Some of it might be somewhat obvious, seems obvious at least to me. One of those would be to some extent repetition of key words. So for me, right, if you're going to see a term like Christos in Pauline texts that occurs 270 times. There are different ways of reading this evidence, but I guess mine would be to say, well, is that, that seems to be meaningful of something. The same thing, I guess I would say, it's not just sheer accumulation of statistics per se, but right, if you're having the repetition of pistis over and over again, and then also, I guess, sort of like insignificant contexts, right? I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to, sort of start out with Romans and say, Romans 1 through 5, 1, 16 through 17, 3, 21 through 26, some of these passages, right, seem to be really key. And if Paul is putting, right, in these significant passages, has texts such as Dikaia Sune Theou related to Pistis Christou, right, in a way that seems programmatic, and it's also repeated frequently, that's going to count for something, I think. For me, there's also a level of when, Paul is going to define his gospel. So in places like, Romans 1 or 1 Corinthians 15, to some extent, something like, Philippians 2, places where it looks as if he's sort of, obviously saying, hey, this is programmatic, right? In Philippians 2, this, whatever we want to call it, Christ hymn, right, is sort of like a key point for making sense of the entire letter. Or in my opinion, if Romans 1, 16 through 17, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, on and on. Well, he's told us what the gospel is in Romans 1 through 5. So this isn't necessarily scientific, but it is to say sort of like repetition of key words. Are there programmatic texts, right, in Paul that he seems to be building upon? Places maybe where he's drawing upon prior tradition, and then trying to expand on that in more detail. These are going to be places then where I'm going to say, I'm not going to probably organize a coherent Pauline theology on 1 Corinthians 11 or, whatever the text may, 11, 2 through 6, head coverings or whatever, right? I'm actually going to try to organize my theology based on these places where it seems as though Paul himself is telling us, hey, this is what I'm all about, or this is how I, as I expand upon, or as I continue to go in the letter to address key issues, I'm going to do so in a way that's expanding on some of these key terms, themes, and concepts.
So this is just a little pushback that I just thought of. What would you say to someone who says, well, like E.P. Sanders, right, who says, okay, covenant is everywhere, even though the term isn't there. The flip side, right, is people have read Christos as meaningless because it's everywhere, right? So how do we kind of like parse out? I mean, obviously, one answer you said was like key passages, right, where this sort of language is used. But how do we tell, for Paul, what is operating sort of beneath the surface, like covenant? Is covenant there or not? Maybe it's hard to tell because we don't have the word, right, so often. But then, in contrast with something like Christos, we have the word so often that some people have just said, oh, well, he's clearly using it as a name because why does he say it all the time, right?
No, right. That's why I kind of went over that quickly where I'm like, the 270 occurrences can be read in different ways, right?
Right.
So I think this is where I think Novinson's argument was so helpful and in some ways pushed against some of the maximalist interpretations of, everywhere you see Christos, it's messianic everything. I think for what Novinson did that was helpful was to basically say, it's an honorific, and at times, right, it just, there's no mileage that's being gotten out of sort of, okay, it's a messianic, sort of text or scenario per se, but that's just who he is. He's the Messiah, Jesus. Then there are other instances where basically the text occurs, either I would say within sort of like Messianic scriptures of Israel, something along those lines, right? A Genesis 49, a 2 Samuel 7, a Psalm 2, or something along those lines, or in combination with a Messianic scenario or motif. So, the one who is going to be the eschatological judge that brings all things into submission to the Father, or the one who is born according to the seed of David, right, according to the flesh, but is installed as the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness and the resurrection, the resurrection from the dead. So in those instances, right, I would say in every instance where you see Christos, it means Messiah. But only in some of them is Paul basically saying, right, I'm actually tapping into something like a Messianic scenario or motif or something along those lines. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think about it even in honorifics that we use today. So something like president, you would have, even though you would call the person that, and there would be meaning in every occurrence, there are going to be some texts where you're talking about the president as president, and other texts where you're going to be referring to the president just as someone who eats, breakfast in the morning, just like every one of us, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
I think this, again, going back to Novinson's work, where he showed like that your contemporary analogy, is sort of like, I mean, it's a contemporary analogy for, I think, what holds true in the ancient world. Every occurrence of Judas Maccabee, I mean, there's a reason he has that honorific. And there are times you might play on it, right? Or Caesar Augustus or whatever it may be, without necessarily activating an entire theology of, right, Judah the Hammer, or right, Caesar the Augustus in every single instance. So
right, but at the same time, you do see, like, again, I'm just even thinking about our day. If I say President Biden, it sounds very different than if I say Joe, right? And there is I just can't say that about, I can't refer to him as Joe because we're just not there, right? But I would say President Biden, and everyone would see me respecting him in some way as president whenever I do that, right? And in the same way, right, we could say, okay, then every time we see Christos, there is this relationship that Paul is saying that he has to Jesus of Nazareth, one of, whatever it means to be a Messiah. So then, and you've said, I mean, you've kind of mentioned this. So you mentioned, okay, some of these texts are messianic, right? How do we determine whether a text is messianic? So we could go to other Second Temple Jewish texts, but just what are some of the things that you would look for in determining whether this text is talking about messianism and fitting Jesus into it?
Right. Yeah, I would kind of be looking for, at least two of three things probably, but maybe hopefully three things. One would be, do we have a term, a title, a honorific such as Christos or, 2 Samuel 7 and, Psalm 2 and all these other texts, right, that speak of the Messiah as the Son of God. I will be a father to him and he will be a son to me. Language of, Davidic shepherd or whatever it is. I'm looking for some sort of title. It doesn't have to be necessarily always uniquely messianic, but one that basically would kind of lead me into some sort of messianic scenario. That would be the first thing I'd be looking for, or one of the three things. Second thing would be, is the text, or is the argument being made with respect to with a kingship or messianic passage? When I read Romans 1, I just taught on Romans yesterday, so Romans 1 is fresh on the mind, but Romans 1 through 5, I'm reading verses 3 through 4, and I don't think there are any, there's no like direct quotations, but it seems to me as if, you have a lot of right, scriptures of Israel that speak of a Messiah or a king, that are in play there. 2 Samuel 7 in terms of, that says, I will raise up seed after you. Jesus, right, is born from the seed of David. Psalm 2 language, right, I will give the nations as an inheritance for your earth. This is getting into verse 4 and 5 and even some maybe of Romans 15. whereas Paul's task is to bring about the obedience of faith among the nations, things along these lines. So I'm looking then secondly to see 1 Corinthians 15, another example, right, where you have Psalm 110, Psalm 8, some of these royal texts from the Psalms, right, that are being predicated of Jesus the Messiah. So first one's honorific. Second one I would be looking for would be some sort of scripture, Old Testament or Scripture of Israel. The third thing then would be, is there a sort of like a Messianic scenario or motif? This one becomes a little bit more imprecise, but if you have all three, then I think, at least for me, you're sort of on good ground here. Is Jesus being spoken of as the shepherd, of Yahweh, who brings back the scattered sheep, Ezekiel, 33 through 37 or whatever. Is Christ spoken of as, the one who will mediate God's justice, something along those lines. So there's a variety, is he a temple builder? Something along those lines that's basically, maybe not uniquely, although it'd be nice if it, sometimes it is uniquely, but it's related to some kind of, I just use language of motif or scenario.
Right. So I feel like you're kind of equating Messiah and King. Is that fair?
I think probably it is fair. I probably do have some overlap there. I mean, I think of, Christos is basically the Lord's anointed, right? It's shorthand and the Septuagint.
I'm not pushing back necessarily, but noting.
Yeah, but so the Lord's anointed, it's sort of like as the king, shift into Greco-Roman language to some extent. It's sort of like the earthly mediator of the will of the gods, right? Who are in heaven, or the will of God. So yeah, I do see certainly with starting to some extent in Genesis 49 with Judah, moving then into let me skip a little bit here from Numbers 24, but going into 1st and 2nd Samuel, as if it's centering upon sort of like the Davidic monarchy in particular. Yeah.
So then can we read like kingly motifs as messianic motifs? I mean, right, because like even though there's overlap, are we going to say, okay, this text is talking about a king, but it might not say Mashiach or Christos, right? Does that allow us still to say, okay, it's still a messianic text, right? Because it's talking about a king, and we know that Paul, when he uses Christos, he's referring to the messianic king. Does that make sense? Just again, for helping us to see what kinds of passages in Paul, and what kinds of themes, and I can't really think of a passage where you have king but not Messiah. maybe that tells us something.
Well, there is. Let me put it this way. I mean, yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's not. I mean, worthy of a lot of engagement and interaction. So for me, right, I had tried to deal this in a way, wrestling with the same question. Basically, if the Old Testament is speaking of basically, let's say Josiah, right, as an ideal king, but it's not using the language of Christos, right? You have a lot of, really powerful Old Testament texts, or we could even say Greco-Roman texts, which is, of course, are not speaking about a Messiah, but are speaking of like what a good or ideal king is, right? Can those be drawn upon as evidence that might have then influenced Paul? I tend to think, right, that on the one hand, what's prominently featured in Paul's letters, right, in terms of the scriptural texts that he draws upon, are mostly going to be these messianic oracles. Some of our already named, Isaiah 11 we could add, and a variety of others. But that you also, right, I think have the possibility that as Paul is reflecting upon, right, the meaning of who Jesus was, that these sort of like good king, ideal king texts might have influenced him as well. So to give one example, I'd love to see more, I got positive feedback, but I haven't had as much engagement with this argument as what I would, I'd love to have more, I guess. But I argued that in Galatians 5:13 and 14, and Galatians 6:2, especially when Paul refers to the Nomos Christou, right, the law of Christ or the Torah of Christ, that there's good reasons for thinking he's activating this, right, kingly depiction of the Messiah or the king as one who is positively related to the laws. I don't want to talk forever here, but so like I'll go back and say, yeah, I mean, one of the sources then I'm looking at here is, can we look at Deuteronomy 17, or can we, that speaks of basically Israel's ideal king as one who loves God's law, right? Does God's law, promulgates God's law among the people. And then can we look at sort of its trajectory throughout the Old Testament, where you have, right, in 1st and 2nd Kings, right, good kings like Josiah, who are those that don't veer to the left or to the right. They walk in the footsteps of David, also, right, by loving God's law and doing the covenant. I don't know if Deuteronomy 17 is a messianic text, right? I don't know if whatever it is, I'll probably get it wrong, 2nd Kings, 20, whatever, where, the passages of Josiah. I don't know if that's necessarily, those are messianic texts. Right, but I at least think it's relevant to like draw on what would it look like, right, for this, right, Yahweh's anointed to embody what the good king was supposed to embody. So I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah. I'm really tempted to get into a discussion about the king and the law, which I have in my notes that we will get to. But let's just talk about it now, because I just, you brought it up, and let's just see how this works out. So I think of like 1 Corinthians 9 as well, right? Where same thing, right? What's so interesting about that text to me is that Paul makes a distinction between the law of Moses and the Messiah's law, right? And he calls the Messiah's law the law of God, right? Not that I'm not under any law. I am under a law, the Christ law, right? And that is the law of God, right? Which really remarkable for a Second Temple Jew to say. I mean, just in so many ways. And so I guess my yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of, ways we could go with this question of law. How does even, the Old Testament, right? You have, John Collins has done work on what Torah meant to, people in early Judaism all the way up through Second Temple Judaism, and then also in Paul. And we're going to talk to him about nomos in this series as well.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
But he points out that one of the remarkable things about ancient Israelite society is that the king does not give the law, right? And it's God himself that gives the law. And that is remarkable because in the ancient world, you always had kings giving laws, and that is supposed to represent, what the deity wants. But the king, in some ways, is God's mediator to the people, right? But then, what does that tell us about Jesus' identity as Messiah, right? So if the Messiah is now giving the law for Paul, and as a Second Temple Jew, only one person, being gives the law, right? It's God, right? And so is that a way that he is identifying the Christ with, God himself, or maybe Moses, right? And how can you flesh out this idea for us more? Like, what is the relationship between Messiah and law in especially in terms of the way that the Messiah himself gives us a law?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think 1 Corinthians 9, Romans 13 through 15, even though it doesn't, exactly use the language of law of Christ there, Galatians 5 and 6. So I'm trying to sort of like, those are my sources, and I'm trying to sort of, give an answer to that question. I see it as, on the one hand, is there something new or unique with Jesus in the law? Yes, or different? Yes and no. The no would be, right, I would understand that basically, reading Galatians 5, 13 and 14 with the law of Christ, Galatians 6, 2, I think those two texts have to be read together. Galatians 5, 13 through 14, right, speaks about the law having been come to fulfillment or completion. I think it's the perfect form of plerao. In this one word, right, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, right? So, drawing upon Leviticus 19, 18. As a summary of basically the the Ten Commandments, right? The second table of the law, right? And all of the sort of ethical and horizontal obligations that were wisely imposed upon Israel. Keep going with this for a second, right? But Leviticus 19, the good arguments, right? That's sort of like seeing that as in some ways almost like the center point of the Torah, right? In terms of like it giving us a sort of an ethical handbook or guidance for what the Torah is supposed to be about. So Jesus, right, when he comes then and brings that word to fulfillment, right, I understand that. I mean, Lou Martin has it in terms of, right, Christ takes the law in his own hands. Is that how he says it? Boy, now I might be getting confused with Teresa Morgan's argument. But basically, right, he does something to the law, right? He brings it to its completion as he, right, embodies it perfectly. And as well as perhaps, I think 1 Corinthians 9, there's good evidence for, right, drawing upon him as one who was teaching Leviticus 19:18, right, in terms of some of the sayings of Jesus that populate 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. So the unique element is that I think Paul sees him as basically the singular one, right, that lives it out, embodies it. And by our union or relationship to the Messiah, right, then God's people are also empowered by his Spirit to basically live out, right, this Leviticus 19:18 as a summary. Love your neighbor as yourself. On the other hand, it's what's not unique about it, right, is that there's an element, I mean, Jesus himself is, I don't know if subordinated is the right way to say it, but right, he himself is the one that is basically, right, saying Leviticus 19:18, and by extension, the Torah, right, is the authoritative, will of God, revelation of God. I'm not coming to bring sort of like a new law, a new ethical handbook per se, right? I am rather the one that is, bringing it to its fulfillment and its completion. So,
yeah. So is that basically how you take Romans 10:4? So the Christ is the end of the law, for those who believe. Obviously, this is a big debated passage. The big debate here, for those of you that don't know this world of debate, is how we take telos. Tell us, right? How do we understand? I'll just read it in Greek. Telos garnomou Christos est dikausunen panti to pisteonti. So normally, I'll just look at the ESV. So for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So the question is, what does this end mean? Is it fulfillment? Is it in some ways end?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think of it probably, to some extent, goal and end can both work in a way, but I think goal...
Well, yeah, I think part of the problem is that there is an end at the goal.
Yes, right. It is a race metaphor. There's a race metaphor that's going on in Romans 9:30 and following, right? Yeah. I think what I don't like about the translation "end" is that it can too easily go with something I don't think Paul would agree with. That basically the abrogation of the law, or the law is over, or something along those lines. So yeah, my quick version of that I think would be basically there is a race metaphor that's going on. Israel was running the race, but they didn't see, right, for Paul, they didn't see that basically the goal of the law, right, the goal of Torah is Christ. And so Paul is, right, in a reading that I think will only make sense if you have already granted him his Christological claims, right, is reading Leviticus 18:5 maybe, but certainly Deuteronomy 30, right, these Torah texts as if the obvious referent of, these Torah texts is basically Jesus, the Messiah. And as a result, right, Israel trips and keeps running the race, right, whereas the pagans are not even, aware that they're running in the race, and surprisingly, voila, they get to the finish line, right, because they, right, embrace Christ and find out this is what the Torah was all about at the end. So if I had to, do my own English translation, I would probably, I agree with you, right? In terms of how you stated it, I would probably, to avoid misunderstanding, probably my preference would not be to use the language of end. and probably would use goal, right, to say like the goal of the Torah is, basically that Christ is the goal of the Torah. So I don't know. Does that conform? You're doing some work on this right now. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I actually think that it's not so much about like historical eschatological, but more so there is this ambiguity in the last phrase, pantito posteonti. So the problem is that could be understood as for all who believe, or to all who believe. So the question is whether the that group of individuals is benefiting for, right? Or whether they now see the Christ as the end of the law for righteousness. So I actually think it should be taken in that way. So the idea is that it's not talking about the Christ came and now there's an end to Torah, but people that see that righteousness can be through the Messiah now no longer use the Torah as a means to righteousness. That would be my reading, because if in the passage you're talking about two different groups, right? Jews and Gentiles. How do they obtain righteousness? Well, the Gentiles sought it through law. They didn't obtain it. The Gentiles are seeking it through the Messiah. They are obtaining it. And so he says, okay, well, actually, for everyone, Jew and Gentile, who wants to be righteous, they realize once the Messiah comes, okay, this is actually the path to righteousness and not Torah anymore. Of course, that does, you have to have so many qualifications with that, right? It doesn't mean that they're not obeying Torah, but it does mean that they are not obeying Torah as a means to righteousness, because when they are obeying the Christ, they actually are obeying the Torah in the way that it should be. So that would be my reading, and that, but anyway, we can go back and forth about this. But this actually leads us to the question of righteousness, right? So we talked about nomos, so we could probably spend the next 3 hours talking about nomos and the Christ. But I want to get through these terms because I think they're all significant in their own way, and they're all interrelated as well. So, but how then? We've kind of talked about this idea of righteousness without really defining it. How, in general, just taking a step back, how are kings related to righteousness in the ancient world? And I know you have, done work on this both in Christ is the King, especially, then also in Messianic Theology. But just so when I think we don't really understand this interconnection so well, because we just don't see how all of this background of kingship and righteousness are intimately connected. And for us, kings are often tyrants, right? They're often people that aren't good. But in fact, it seems to be the exact opposite in these key texts.
Yeah. So how do kings relate to righteousness? This was one of the things I felt when I was doing researching Christ as King, I kind of stumbled upon, and there were a few people that had written on this, but not as many as I might have expected. So another aspect of my argument that I'm like, boy, I would love to see people take my work and extend it or critique it or something. It'd be fun to, whatever it is, just sort of. So yeah, one of the things I stumbled upon, that basically how frequently justice and righteousness language just in general show up with ancient kings, both in the Old Testament as well as in the Greco-Roman side. So I don't have all these texts memorized, but it's really, there's this great book by, I don't know if I'll say his name right, and I probably shouldn't bring it up because I don't have the title either, but I think his name is Moshe Weinfeld.
Moshe Weinfeld, yeah.
Yeah, who wrote a book, I don't have the title, but it's it basically has to do with like the king
I
is.
read it.
You know it? What's the name of the title?
I can't remember. Social justice in the ancient Near East and the Old Testament.
Okay, something I don't know. There's basically it's like wow. It takes us through all the ways in which the king's one of his fundamental tasks, if not his fundamental task, was to basically be a mediator of justice and righteousness. So right? David, right? One of the things, I think it's in 2 Samuel 8, but it's like he's judging, right? He's judging all of the people, right? He's giving them standard, right? Responses for justice and righteousness. Seems like this is, the same sort of thing Solomon's doing. You get it repeated, right? In terms of hearing court cases, right? Maybe Moses is a prototype, as Philo thought he was, of, right, an ancient king, right? Who's hearing the counsel, the arguments of the people and rendering judicial verdicts for them. Presuming, of course, that the king is then one as the mediator of God's will himself is just and righteous. I think it was Fergus Miller on one of his books on, obviously I'm not remembering any of these titles, but one of his main books on the emperor talks about I think it's one of the first lengthy chapters, but that basically when the emperor would travel around, is just constantly receiving, right, delegations, right, letters, petitions, and then was, right, basically enacting justice. So that's one of the things, right? And it also presumes that one of the things that they're supposed to do is that they themselves are actually just and righteous, as I had already said. They have that, it seems like, moral quality or disposition. Well, there's a lot of different things we could, routes we could go here going to Paul, but I'll just say one of them, and before, if you want to come back and we could shift gears with Messiah and justice later as well, and expand on this, but Paul frequently, of course, speaks of Christ. I can think of a few different ways to frame this, but one who is an agent of God's justice. He is, right, 2 Corinthians 5:10, 5:9 and 10, I think it is, right, where basically we'll all appear before the judgment seat, the bema tu Christou. Paul in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, right, even in some, tricky eschatological scenarios that I don't fully understand, but what is clear is that basically, right, the day of the Lord, Jesus is going to be the one that essentially executes God's justice and judgment for the people. Will destroy the wicked, right? Will vindicate the righteous. Romans, he's spoken of one who, because, this is where Paul might be a little subversive in some ways, because Christ himself was unfairly executed and then was God's righteousness, God's justice was revealed in resurrecting Jesus from the dead, right? As a result, as the resurrected and enthroned Messiah, he's the one basically then has the judicial ability to protect his people and establish them in a kingdom of justice and righteousness. So I'm thinking a lot of Romans 8 here, right? Nobody can bring any katakrima, right? Any condemnation against God's people because they belong to the Messiah. Or one of my favorite passages, Romans 8:31 through 39, because he is the one that has died and is now enthroned at God's right hand. He is the one, nobody can bring a charge against God's elect, right? And it's filled with this sort of like judicial justice and righteousness language, but in a way that's basically saying Christ alone has supreme judicial authority and power. He's died and resurrected, and we belong to him. Therefore, right, there's no other threat, no other power can bring, right, an attack upon us. So, yeah, I could keep going, but yeah.
Right. So the point is that there's a very strong connection, right, between kings and righteousness.
That's what I'm trying. Yeah, that's at least what I'm trying to argue. That yes, well, for sure there is. That other people, I don't ever want to say I uniquely saw something here, or whatever. Right? But I think it's like really easy to find, as we were discussing predecessors, Fergus Miller, Moshe Meinfeld, right? Others that have argued this in some other texts. Maybe in terms of making that connection, and Paul at least felt what I felt as though as like trying to, put some new pieces of the puzzle together a little bit. So
yeah, it's interesting. That book, by the way, is Social Justice in Ancient Israel and the Ancient Near East. I just looked it up. Yeah. So
now we can't read it. It's woke, right? Social justice. Right. You'd have to. Sorry, King David was woke.
Yes. I remember reading it, and I remember thinking, why aren't Pauline scholars reading this? Because it seems very obvious, right? When you look at text after text after text after text and say, oh, everyone in the ancient world, in the ancient Near East, thought this way. They all said, there is the role of the king is to bring righteousness. And then it's like, well, that makes perfect sense of these texts in Paul that says the Messiah is revealing God's righteousness. I mean, it just like, it fits so remarkably well. And it's a weird thing because I mean, again, when I read it, so I did my dissertation on righteousness language in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. So just bring this full circle back to nomos now, because I think this is just fun. So then the question would be, what is the relationship between the law and righteousness, right? So if we have this strong connection between the Messiah and righteousness, why, like, is the law connected to righteousness? Like, do we need the law for righteousness? How do those three sort of things relate?
I have like 20 questions and things, that are going on in my head right now that it's, I'm like, how do I get this right into like one track that makes sense? So I'm super interested. We'll have to talk more about your dissertation, and let me just make one comment and then I'll, get back to your actual question. I don't know if I'm not an anti-Lutheran or anti-Reformation. I try not to, go down that well-worn route, but I do sometimes wonder if, I think of the Psalms, how frequently the Psalms are speaking about, right, the king's righteousness and the king, or the Messiah, right, the David, whoever is the speaker of it, right, maybe speaking from New Testament vantage point at times here, right, basically saying, I'm righteousness, therefore God, I want your righteousness, right, look upon my righteousness and vindicate me. Yeah. I have been so surprised that I don't know if it's because when we see dikaiosune theou or we see dikaiosune, our minds just can't help but sort of get into questions of justification and imputed righteousness, which the texts themselves do raise, right? But in a way that sort of like moves our heads into, later theological debates, and we, miss the fact that Paul in Romans 1:2 is said as, the gospel of God pre-promised through the scriptures of Israel, right? The sacred writings and the holy prophets, that Paul himself wouldn't basically be saying, right? I've got a Messiah, and I've got the Lord, and I've got the Lord's anointed, and we've got righteousness. It just seems like one of the obvious places we should be going to would be sort of the Psalms and a lot of these Old Testament texts, basically, to understand what's going on there. So I hope that's not too much of a detour, except to say I'm really on board with, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see that in your work as well, going to the Psalms for this kind of language. I mean, it's so frequent in the Psalms to say, I am righteous. And even that idea, part of the problem is Paul's interpretation of some of these Psalms in Romans 3, right? In some of these other texts, there's no one righteous, no, not one. And so then we say, okay, well, we go back to those Psalms and we say, this guy's not really righteous, right? Or we have to have some sort of qualification for these texts, and then we're thrown into the Lutheran sort of loop of, okay, I'm not righteous, I need a righteousness, where do I get it? That kind of thing.
Right.
Anyway, so to the question of how does the law fit into these questions? Because again, my thing is, like, as a Second Temple Jew, at least, okay, so this is obviously another big question. I would take the position that the Jews were using Torah as a means to righteousness. Even if E.P. Sanders has like the famous pushback on this, like, okay, it's really grace, right, and forgiveness. But even if you have all those things, still, the framework, and even if you have covenant, the framework is still Torah. If you don't have Torah, you're not righteous, period, right? And it's the only means to get there, I think, for a lot, at least some strands of Second Temple Judaism. So then how does Paul, so we've said for Paul, or at least in the ancient world, right, there is a strong connection between righteousness and the Messiah. So how do these three things relate in your view? Righteousness, Christos, and nomos.
I would see it probably something along. I think I would agree with you. Although there are times, I go back and forth, and maybe by the time the podcast is published, I'll have changed my mind.
It'll only be next week, so you don't have much time.
Okay, good. But it's it does seem to me, at least Paul. Yeah, I get. You know, I don't feel comfortable making a lot of claims about, you know, most Jews or all Jews as much, but at least Paul seems to read the Old Testament in a way whereby he thinks that Leviticus 18:5 says, right, the one who does these things will live by them. They will have, and I think for Paul, that's sort of like eschatological life, or whatever it is we want to call it. Life is not a synonym, but, you know, overlapping term basically with righteousness. Dikaiosune is, you know, throughout Paul's letters, especially Romans and Galatians. So, right, for Paul, however, right, dikaiosune theou did not come about by Leviticus 18:5. And I think Leviticus, you know, what is the phrase? Ta erga tu namu, right? The works of the law is to some extent just a shorthand for Leviticus 18:5. So, that doesn't mean it's bad. It just is sort of like the law didn't give anyone life. It didn't ever resurrect anyone. And, you know, the resurrection came about through pistis Jesu Christou. God's righteousness was revealed, right, by the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, also connected with the language of life and righteousness in Galatians. And so life, righteousness comes about for Paul through, right, the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, through Jesus Christ's fidelity, whatever it is, you know, however it is we want to translate that. Yeah, so I guess that's how it's, you know, and I think that is, you know, a pretty bold, strange, unique claim, you know, for Paul to make. And so this is where, you know, sometimes certain folks with Paul within Judaism, it's like, yeah, I think Paul was Torah observant. I certainly think the categories to understand Paul, right, are Jewish, on and on and on, sort of, yeah. And yet I also think, like, yeah, there's a reason people didn't like Paul. Yeah, there's a reason people thought he was a problem and a nuisance and maybe even an apostate, right? So, you know, because it puts you in a situation where there is one place where life and righteousness is revealed. It's Jesus. That's a pretty bold claim, obviously. And it also, I do think it involves some kind of reevaluation of the law, you know, where Paul is saying, like, the law cannot give life. The law cannot resurrect anyone from the dead. The law is wise, right? The law provides ethical wisdom and instruction and exhortation. The law has a prophetic aspect, and it, you know, it came from God and it's to remain in place, you know, but it is not something that, you know, was able to basically give life. So I don't know. Does that help in terms of what you're asking?
Yeah. So I guess the main point would be that while the law might have many other functions, it doesn't have this function, this specifically messianic function of righteousness. And I think if you do connect the idea of messiahship and kingship to the ancient idea of, you know, righteousness and bringing about righteousness, it makes perfect sense, right? That once the Messiah came, people would say, okay, well, how does this relate to our alternative view of how we get to be righteous, right? Because, you know, again, I mean, I agree with you. We don't even know what the average Jew thought. I mean, who knows, right? But we can say that there are strands, right? And we can say that there are certain things that some texts say about these things. And I think it's very clear that some texts say that the law is the means, you know, and the fact that, but then you have other texts. I mean, I think of Psalms of Solomon 17, where it's like, the law's not there, right? Righteousness is there. The Messiah is there. And so if you were to talk to this Jew and say, hey, you know, when the Messiah comes, how are people going to be righteous, right? I mean, I think you would have had, I mean, certainly some people would have said law, right? But some people probably would have spoken about the Messiah. I mean, some people did, right? That's what Psalms of Solomon says. And so then the whole question of, you know, what is the role? I mean, you know, you were referencing the Pauline Judaism school. I mean, for people that aren't aware of that, basically, I you know, this it's kind of hard to categorize all of them because they believe a lot of different things. But I think one kind of distinctive feature is this sort of like two path to salvation kind of thing, or righteousness, in that you know, Gentiles were saved by, or were became righteous by the Christ. Jews remained faithful to Torah, and that's the way that they became righteous. But even Jews, right, like the author of Psalms of Solomon, sometimes said, you know what, the Christ is going to be associated with righteousness, and that's kind of the world they lived in, right? The hope for an ideal king was the hope for an ideal righteousness that was different than what they currently had, which was law.
Yeah, I think I'll just, make, it is tricky talking about these schools. There are some for sure, you're right, like John Gager, among others, that have that two-path. Others like, Matt Thiessen, Stan Stowers, and I think Paul Fredrickson, right, that don't really. But I take your larger point, right, that there is, right, when we're going back into, it's so difficult, I guess, in terms of like trying to do something like give a pattern of religion to, I'm using square quotes for those of you that can't see me, Judaism, right? Or something like that. It involves a lot of, point taken for sure. Yeah.
So then we've covered righteousness, nomos, and then Messiah, right? And then let's talk about pistis and pisteo. So obviously this is something that you've mentioned. Okay, let's just back up and say, okay, if Jesus is the Messiah, what implications does that have for the way we would respond to him, right? He's a king. He brings about righteousness. Specifically, there is this very common phrase. It's actually not as common in Paul as, people or would probably think. But the, pisteo eston Christon. So, I'm making that up. But the phrase, you just translate it, I believe in Christ. Given that he is a Messiah, what does that mean? What is our proper response to him as, pistis?
First of all, let me say, I think there's a variety of responses, and I'll get to pistis in a second, but, reading through Paul, it seems like one of the things, Julian Smith, who's also done work on kingship, has written a little bit about this on Ephesians, and I don't know if he published. Yeah, I think it shows up in his new book, Paul and the Good Life, too, in 2 Corinthians. But one of the things is the king transforms his people to the king's character, right? So we take on the character. That goes back even, to the law of Christ, where it's like he brings the law to completion, Leviticus 19:18, so that his people, right, embody the same moral attributes or qualities. That's one way of responding. I think another way of responding is, I still think that Colossians 1 and Philippians 2 are probably hymns, and there's early Christian evidence, real obviously from Pliny, among others, that basically they worship him. They sing hymns, right, to the Messiah. If you'll let me use Ephesians and, Colossians as Pauline evidence, or even 1 Corinthians 14, right? You basically have, you have Martin Hengel, I think, who wrote this really good essay. I'm just like one train of thought to another, right? So, right, but it's basically from these texts, right, that are talking about, you have these commands to write hymn to the Messiah, sing to, the Christ. And you have a lot of evidence for the early Christians as basically composing songs, composing hymns, way before we had, the Vineyard movement or, whatever. It's like the early Christians were the ones that were doing these from the very beginning. So that's another way of responding. Let me go to pistis, I guess. I think I don't know if Matt Bates will listen to this. I think I'm, generally. I'll send it to him. What's that?
Oh, we'll send it to him.
Yeah. Okay. Matt. I think he's, I don't want to use like the kingship framework to read every pistis text, but I'm, by and large, in many ways, in agreement with and strongly sympathetic to, something that is along the lines of allegiance or fidelity or ongoing loyalty. I don't want to give like one English translation for pistis in every occurrence, but I do think, right, Philippians 1:29, other passages basically throughout the New Testament, Revelation has a lot of these interesting passages in terms of like, maintain to the fidelity or the faith of Jesus in Romans 13 and Romans 14, that there is something that's more than, belief or what we often mean by faith. And sometimes there's, Romans 4 might be a good text for, forward-looking trust, almost like hope, but sometimes even more stronger than just trust, but even sort of like this active, ongoing loyalty, allegiance to the Messiah, to the King. I'll stop there for now. Yeah.
Yeah. So is it then, like, just thinking through this? I mean, I think on a very popular level, right? When you translate something like, pisteo eston Christon as believe in the Messiah, like what people will often take from that is, I believe, that Jesus is the Messiah, something like that. Like that. And of course they wouldn't even translate it as Messiah, right? They would just say Christ. And then, I believe in Jesus, right? As something like, I subscribe to, this historical event about, Jesus dying on a cross for my sins or something like that. So is that element there? Like, is that what Paul is referring to in these texts? Or can we just say, like, that's just wrong? I mean, obviously, there are some texts, I think of Romans 10, right, that talk about believing that something happened, right? That God raised Jesus from the dead, right? And so that's a necessary thing to believe. The question is, like, in our response, when Paul uses this language, like, is he talking about that, or is he talking about, being faithful to the Messiah? Because I mean, I think again, it's easy to just say, oh, well, like, we're kind of splitting hairs here, but on a very popular level, I think it's huge for people, whether they're called to, okay, I have to be faithful to the Messiah, or I have to just have faith in the Messiah, or believe in the Messiah, or whatever that means. They're going to respond differently. Does that make sense?
Totally. I think two things to say. First of all, I think, if you're in John or you're in Acts and you have Paul going throughout this, synagogues and trying to convince them, right, the Jews that he's arguing with or reasoning with, that the Jesus is the Christos, right? There are these passages where it's like, or these things have been written so that you may believe, right, that Jesus is the Messiah, or the Messiah is Jesus, however we, want to translate that. There are instances where it seems like, the emphasis is sort of like a confessional statement or an evangelistic kind of statement, where the goal, right, is to convince people to believe that this person is the Lord's anointed. And so there's a variety. That's where it's like, I'm not sure in some of these passages I would want to translate that as if it was, these things have been written so that you may have, fidelity, or so that you may have allegiance, or, something along those lines. And I like it that you brought up Romans 10, 9 and 10. If you pistues, or whatever it is, right? If you believe these things, I guess my response there would be to say, I don't know, it's tricky in terms of the translation. I don't think I would want to translate that as allegiance or fidelity or something. I don't think that's what's going on, but I think it is basically Paul drawing upon, right, the earliest Christian confession, right? Jesus is Messiah. Jesus is Lord. But when I think of work, this is a long time ago since I've read this, but people like Anthony Thistleton have done in the past, in terms of when you make that sort of speech act, when you make that confession, you're not just saying, I cognitively believe something, right? You are actually committing yourself with that confession to a particular way of life, a particular lifestyle, that may not be saying, right, I am, I'm not trying to smuggle in works or obedience per se, right? The goal is, right, I mean, the confession is pretty simple, right? Do you believe that Jesus is Messiah and Lord? Well, Paul believes, I think, if you commit yourself to that basic confession, then you are, right, saying no to idolatry, for example. You're doing a lot of things, right, that are very embodied, that are going to be manifesting themselves in another way of life.
Yeah, so there's a sort of implicit faithfulness that's required of you. I think this is part of the problem in this discussion, is that many times we just throw a bunch of glosses at these words, so it's like, oh, well, it means all of these things, but when we do that, it's like, it's not the case that in each of these contexts, it means all of these things, right? Even though that sometimes like there might be this sort of implicit thing in the background of saying, okay, well, Paul is assuming that if you're going to confess, or if you're going to believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, then you will also be faithful to him as your king, right? I mean, he just doesn't have a category, or he might not, let's just say, have a category for people that would, believe in that way and not be faithful to Jesus as the Messiah. But that doesn't mean that text is saying that you need to be faithful to Jesus the Messiah, right?
Right. There isn't, let me put it this way. There isn't for Paul a category of someone that does Romans 10, 9, and 10 that isn't then also doing Romans 12 through 15. They themselves, and because they've already put their money where their mouth is in terms of probably, right, a lot of these Gentiles have, right, made great sacrifices in terms of at cost to themselves and their families by renouncing, right, certain other forms of worship and all of the consequences that go with that. So to make this confession, right, is right, you're basically signing up then for not just, a private individual, living in a secular world sort of confession and nobody else knows, but you're actually signing up to a much more embodied way of life that has a lot of social ramifications for sure.
Right. And I think that's part of the problem today is just that we live in a different world, So I just realized that I have only gone through about half of these questions. So we're just going to skip some things. But I would like to, we have to get to Israel a little bit and talk about Israel, because we're going to have Jason Staples talk about that in more depth. He's recently done work on what is Israel, and that would have come out, it did come out after your Messianic Theology of the New Testament. But there's also, I think of Wright, who talks about the Messiah sort of redefining Israel around himself, those kinds of ideas. Can you tell us a little bit about the connection between, Messiah and Israel, and who is Israel? And I'm thinking, especially here of Galatians 6:16, right? The Israel of God, like, what does that mean? I don't. We can talk about Romans 9 through 11. I don't know what what Paul is saying there still. But all those sorts of questions. How does the Messiah change? Who is Israel?
Yeah, that's a huge question. It's great you'll have Jason on the podcast. I look forward to. I read his book, and I'm excited to see how that will work itself out in his book on Paul. But my inclination would be to say, it'll be fascinating to see what Jason says in response to this question. I don't know if Jesus changes the identity of Israel. I'm not sure I would be comfortable using that language. Galatians 6:16 is definitely a wild card for me. The other instances of Israel in Paul, I do not think he is redefining the term Israel. Romans 9 through 11 seems to me to be indicating, right, that obviously there is a hardening of the majority of Israel. There still is, for Paul, the eschatological hope and expectation that all Israel will be saved, and I'm not, it's still a question what that exactly means by Israel, but not redefining it along the lines of Jews and Gentiles or the church would be my argument.
So I guess that is part of the question, right? Is, if you do look at Paul's usage of the term Israel, it only starts in chapter 9, right? And so he's talking about all these people before, Jew and Gentile, for sure. And then, I think this is, part of Jason's big point of like, okay, an Israelite is not synonymous with a Jew, right? So then who, and maybe this is just an unfair question. So who is Israel, right? If it's not just the Jews, or maybe, is there a way in which the Messiah changes, something about how we understand Israel, or maybe, or doesn't even change, but just reveals, or helps us understand better who Israel is, right? Because it's not, like, I think Jason has convinced me, at least, that it's not synonymous with Jew. And then we have to ask ourselves, like, is it just an ethnic term? Does it include, who does it include, right?
Yeah, I think So to me, in Romans 9 through 11, I would take it, I don't know, if I would want to use the word ethnic, but probably something like that, the historic people of God, that goes back, right? Just basically goes back to, right, the foundation of God's people, which are a lot of those texts, right, that are showing up there in Romans 9, 6 and following, essentially centering upon the creation of Israel, right? So beginning with the patriarchs, and this is why you have not all Israel comes from Israel, I think, not meaning there's not redefining it along the lines of something that includes Gentiles yet, but that's basically not all Israel is from Israel, is saying that, right, it's just according to God's sovereign choice, right? It's Ishmael, in a way, comes from that lineage, and yet they're not Israel. Right? The Edomites, right? All of the Gentiles, right? In other words, all of those sort of nations are not actually from Israel. God has elected sort of like this one people group with which to accomplish his purposes, into which then the pagans or the nations then are included when the Messiah comes. So if, I don't see the Messiah as changing the identity of Israel. I do see the Messiah, one of the things among many that he does is that he does open up the blessings to then go to the nations or go to the pagans. Obviously, he's wrestling in Romans 9 through 11 with the fact that the majority of Israel has not embraced the message. So I'm pretty reluctant to see Iudaios, Israel, as referring to something that's inclusive of Gentiles. The Galatians 6:16 is the one passage that for me continues to be tricky. Obviously, Galatians, he is, it seems to me as if he's trying to show in Galatians how the nations become part of the family of Abraham, but not becoming Jews or Israelites or undergoing, a certain, right, form of proselyte conversion. There's a lot of conundrums, obviously, in Galatians 6:16, but a lot of, at least my intuitions, would be to not take the Israel of God as referring to something that's inclusive of Gentiles.
So then, but you would accept that the nations are grafted into Israel?
They are.
So then
they become part of, right? They become part of the family of Abraham, without, right, basically becoming proselytes or converts to.
So are they part of Israel?
Are they part? Yeah, great question. They are part of the family of Abraham. They are right.
So no.
I don't know. Does Paul, maybe in Galatians 6:16, maybe that is.
I think
that's the big question, right? Right? Is if the Messiah does allow Gentiles to be grafted in, and then the Messiah does change the identity of Israel in the sense that before it did not include Gentiles and now it can, right? I mean, again, we'll talk to Jason. But I think this is part of the reason why this has been so tricky for people in the past, right? Is that if you allow the grafting, then you don't necessarily have an ethnic identity to that term.
I mean, and this may be where it's, in my mind, I agree with you. I was, convinced by Jason's argument, but obviously those categories in my head may still be Iudaios equals Israel, just, whatever. And maybe, right? Yeah, maybe it's the case. I need to think more about it, that Gentiles, right, become part of the Israel of God, right? But apart from becoming Jews. Yeah, and then I'll have to probably engage in some rereading of Romans 9:6, perhaps, and 11:25 through 27. We'll see. I don't know.
That's great. So just as our last question, I know we've talked on so many things, and there's a lot of things that we didn't get to, but just want to talk about, like, from a higher level perspective, if Jesus' messiahship. So that's your point, right? That Jesus' messiahship is central to Paul, right? And it kind of undergirds, we talked about all these things, right? All these different terms and categories. And you can see how, like, once you accept that Jesus is the Messiah, and that means something different than what scholarship has said, when we then look at righteousness language, faith language, Israel law, all of these things, we have to go back and say, okay, I have to reread this text, to see what it's saying now. So why do you think this is something that has been lost on modern scholarship for so long? There's just been this kind of explosion of, messianic readings of Paul, and just on a higher level, and really in the service of people that believe what we're talking about. How can we avoid blind spots like these in the future?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, I tend to think that there are at least two reasons here. At least there's more, but like at least two big ones. I'm thinking of so many. One, I would say a big culprit was certain history of religions paradigms on the development of early Christian Christology. That were really influential in some of the most important German works on Christology, which also influenced all kinds of North Americans and others, as all kinds of scholars as well. That to state it way too quickly would be something like Paul was more interested in a kurios, a Lord cult, and messiahship wouldn't have meant anything to his Gentile audiences. What would they know about, right, sort of like, the Jewish scriptures and the language meaning something like one who is smeared with oil, right? It makes no sense. So in a nutshell, I would say that exerted a lot of influence on New Testament scholarship, at least from the time of Wilhelm Bousset's Kurios Christos, popularized even further in Rudolf Bultmann's Theology of the New Testament, and just, I think, was taken as a given, and still is for some people taken as sort of a given. So that would be one reason. I think a second reason would be to say, this might be a little more sympathetic, but would be to say, we know what Messiah language looks like. We have it in Matthew, and we have it in John in some places, and we have it in Acts in some places, and Paul, just doesn't have it there. There's no, right, the Lord's anointed, with the genitive, right, retained. There's no, or the Lord's Messiah. There's no, right, Jesus Estin Christos, or something, something like you get in some of those other passages that I think, people were starting to see this before, for sure. But Matt Novinson's work actually showed that's not the best way to go about things. But the fact that Paul's Messiah language doesn't conform to some of these other texts, I think, could be one reason. And then I would also say, to some extent, rehabilitating. I remember Matt Bates, I think he asked me this when I was on Script with Christ is King a long time ago, but basically asked, like, Josh, why would you want to rehabilitate, sort of like a kingship metaphor? Haven't we had enough kings? Haven't kings done enough? And there's a reason to, right, be suspicious of certain, metaphors that structure our theology, that may not have always helped people and may have harmed people. And so there may be some understandable squeamishness about monarchy language. Those are at least a few that come off the top of my head. So
yeah, I think that's a great point to end on. And just something that we didn't get to was just how in your book you talk about, okay, given Jesus as Messiah, how does that relate to our theology and then how we live? We've touched on this in various ways, but properly understood, the kingship idea has massive implications, for daily living, right? That we don't appreciate as much when we just read Christos, or Christ, as a last name, right? And I think that's I think one of the great benefits, one of the great things about your work is you don't just talk about, okay, this means we understand this text differently, but this also means we live differently. We have to be differently in the world now because we have a king, right? And that for people in the ancient world, that was a given, right? If you have a new king, that means you have to be, show allegiance to him. But for us, that's hard for us to understand. And so I think it's great that you kind of, bring that together for us. Do you have any closing thoughts?
I appreciate you bringing that up. I mean, the Messianic Theology of the New Testament, I tried, there's some people have been like, why'd you include that second shorter part of the book, right? I don't know, it's like 300 pages or more on the, the Messianic witness, which is mostly exegesis. And then the last 100+ pages, which is kind of getting at what you're at there. But yeah, I wanted to some extent, try to take a stab and sort of give, without preaching or, just applying the text or whatever, try to show like, this is what it would mean theologically, existentially, if we are sort of taking some of these messianic texts seriously. So yeah, thanks for highlighting that.
Yeah, so that's all we have time for on this episode of the Biblical Languages podcast. Thank you, Josh, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
And thank you to all of our listeners out there who have taken the time to listen to the Biblical Languages podcast brought to you by Biblingo. We hope you enjoyed the episode.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Languages podcast brought to you by Biblingo. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review. You can also follow Biblingo on social media to discuss the episode with us and other listeners. And don't forget to visit biblingo.org to start your 10-day free trial of Biblingo.